Hey guys, Thomas Jr. here, aka Mustache Tom, here to finally review Rockstar's Red Dead Redemption 2. As per usual for my video games review, I'll have two separate sections, one for story and one for gameplay. This will be the continual split until I run into a game that does not have story and just has gameplay, but this has worked so far. These are the two elements that I find the strongest in video games, personally. So, first starting off with the story, I think it should be warranted as I began with my Let's Play of Red Dead Redemption 2 to say what I said at the very beginning of that Let's Play and say that I have not played Red Dead Redemption 1. Uh, so I'm only going to be talking about this game and not comparing it to the first, and I don't know what events lead up to part two, and as much, I'll only be talking about story and an interesting comparison a little bit later on, but nonetheless, let's talk about the story of Red Dead Redemption 2. The only thing I will add is that I only went through the game once, and I'll be going over the story choice that I got. Yes, there's more than one ending to this game, depending on which options you choose and where your morality lies, which already indicates to me that there was a lot more work put into the ending of this game than I initially thought. I kept asking, like, throughout, uh, if the morality and choices actually impacted the ending, and it does indicate, based off of a quick Google search, that that is the case. There are more than one ending, so I'll be talking about the one I got. With that being said, here we go. The story follows Arthur Morgan as he is in the wild, wild west, or the tip end of it, as the industrial age is creeping in, and him and his gang, led by one Dutch, are trying to get by stealing what they can when they can. But with all these little setups, whether it's stealing from a train of people or just stealing from people in general, they're just trying to get by with whatever which way they can. They're a band of misfits. Uh, and you could play the game by going the good guy route, or you could just be as bad and whatever as you know you want to be. So there is a degree of choice in which way you decide to play. In my initial Let's Play, I decided to go the good guy route, uh, and as follows: you go through the story. It's rather long story, by the way, uh, and I'm not complaining about the timing I had in this game. Not so much that if I had taken place in the other side activities, the side quest, that game would have probably taken forever to finish. So sticking to the story was the primary focus of this. Anywho, in the main story, I did feel, and I did say this at the time, that some of the main stories did feel like they were more so side stories, and one complaint I had earlier on is that I didn't like the setup of all these various quests up at the same time. This is something that's actually present in as well as in Grand Theft Auto, uh, and I'm trying to remember if that had too much of an impact in terms of the story in that. I'm pretty sure it was more or less the same. Um, Nonetheless, I don't like the setup in terms of trying to tell a consistent story, even if you have your different choices. Uh, Having one story up, main story up at a time is something I much prefer, much more in the vein of Marvel's Spider-Man, for example, another open world game where you only have that one main story up at a time, and everything else is a side mission. Uh, and again, I said this when it came up, and a few times after the fact, that there was one story that I consistently kept saying was that felt like a side mission, and I'll explain it again, just to reiterate. There's a mission in which there are two rival gangs you're both trying to steal from separately. They're in a warring faction, and during this warring faction, there seems to appear to be this growing Romeo esque Juliet story that is happening in between the fact. You kind of take a side to help these two find love or whatever, and then that's kind of that. It doesn't really feel like it affects the main story in any significant way, but you kind of still do it, and again, it feels more like a side mission based off of the information that I could gather and could remember from that story. There are other stories that feel like that it took precedence over the gameplay rather than the actual story. The one I can think of for this is there is a mission where you go try to save someone. I believe it was John, if I'm not mistaken, uh, from a prison cell or a prison area, and you end up going through a blimp. It's a different way of trying to kind of shoot your way around enemies, for sure. And it definitely stands out as one of the missions where you're kind of doing something slightly different while still shooting people. Uh, but it still serves a story purpose later on, so it does a little bit of both, I suppose, at the end of the day. And anyway, at some point of the story, after you have gathered, or not have gathered, but have gotten to know your crew, uh, it comes to the attention that one Arthur is becoming sick. So there's a bit of setup to what's going to happen later on in the game, and that is that Arthur will die. That is something that will happen in the game, despite whatever. Uh, so, despite this, Arthur continues to fight on the good fight, keeping his character consistent, which, again, we'll come back to that comparison when it comes to it. And it has payoff as once you take control of John and continuing the good guy path that I was continuing, you literally seek out your redemption, which name title implied. You go after the person who did it, you get your redemption or your revenge, game complete. Now, in John's story, your second playable character in this game, he kind of starts off living the simple life, and the gameplay does kind of slow down a significant amount. But in terms of story, he's trying to live the simple life, so makes sense, I suppose. Um, but things don't last that long, as there are still bad people around, and they're trying to make trouble. So John is put into a position where he can't, just stick around. He's an individual that wants to stand up for doing the right thing now and living that simple life. So he goes on about living his simple life from building a house to actually building an entire farm. Um, and you go through that slightly smaller journey. Now, initially, when Arthur died, I thought we were going to be playing as a character named Sadie. This is one of the characters that's on one of the discs, so I figured we were going to be playing as her, but it turns out that is not the case. She's still around and does impact the story as you ride along with her still when you reunite. But nonetheless, you play as John and you get that information of where Micah is, the one that caused the inciting incident to happen, and you go find him uh, after everything seems to be fine and dandy. John just proposed to his woman. He has a kid. He has his farm. Everything seems to be going fine. But they did make that one promise that they were gonna get revenge on Micah for doing what he did to Arthur. Uh, so they do that, and again they seek out their revenge in completion. And interestingly enough, at least in my Let's Play, I don't know if this choice is consistently the same, but Dutch does survive, which he went crazy on the island and then did his own thing. Uh, and it is interesting that he ends up actually siding with you in my choice. Um, that is a little bit bizarre. Probably the most bizarre thing that happens in that game, but I think it works. It seems like he was doubting Micah too, but he was with Micah, so I don't know. That seems to be the closest thing to being inconsistent, but then again, he was being shown to be going crazy, so there was setup to this, I guess. Anyway, nonetheless, you end up killing Micah, getting your revenge, going back home, and you see a little bit of the after credits stuff as the credits are rolling, that John is continuing to go right back to living the simple life, even though the police seem to be looking at them suspiciously, but they don't seem to do anything, so I guess they're fine. Um, and that concludes the basic story. So, what did I think? As an overall presentation, I think for the most part the story is solid. Uh, again, there are just a few minor main missions that I would consider more side missions, but other than that, the story is primarily setting up this crew, what they're all about, and then uh, going through and seeing the changing ways of this group as it develops, seeing the process of Arthur's setup and death and payoff from that death, and then getting to play as John and then living his story. Now, interestingly enough, I did say I was going to make a comparison, and this is a comparison that I did not make, by the way. Other people have made this comparison, and I can kind of see why after the fact. So, here it is. A lot of people have been comparing this to The Last of Us 2, interestingly enough. And from what I can gather, everyone is saying Arthur's death was well more deserved, and I completely agree. There's setup, there's payoff, and there's the execution of his death, at least again from the one I played. All of this fits. It all fits consistently with what we know in the game, even if we were just to look at part 2 in of itself, and everything lines up. By comparison, The Last of Us 2 death scene makes zero sense. And nothing is consistent, and nothing fits. So, yeah, when I was looking at The Last of Us 2, I was in that scene in particular, the one scene I immediately thought of was actually from The Walking Dead, a show that I regularly had watched at the time. Um, and immediately thought of the Negan killing Glenn scene because it's technically very similar in terms of what's happening. Um, and even that was done better, by the way, the Walking Dead scene, which is interesting that I think that no one that I've seen on Twitter has brought that up, which I find bizarre. Um, you have one of the best death scenes in horror, that being Negan killing Glenn, and then you look and compare that to The Last of Us 2 having one of the worst death scenes, and it's, again, a very similar setup, but its execution is just done piss poor. Again, nothing in that death scene makes sense. From every piece of information that we have, again, from the end of part 1, when Jackson gets attacked, to them calming down, that being the characters we follow, Tommy and Joel, uh, becoming soft as people are trying to say that they have become in the 4-year time gap, which there's no evidence to provide for that information, so I don't know where people are getting that from. But even if you give people that, the Joel and Tommy gone soft, which doesn't really make any sense, you have them getting to the little cabin area. You have them, go into the room, say their names, which again, why would they trust a group that's so close to their hometown in Jackson is still beyond me. You would think at the very most they would be a little bit more cautious, question mark, even if they were soft. Again, I think that's a very weak excuse, but nonetheless. Um, so they have them say their names, blah blah blah. Joel gets shot, uh, and then put against that wall. And then we cut back to Ellie making her way over. And if the scene weren't bad enough from Tommy and Joel's decisions, it actually doesn't end there. Because even if you gave people, well, Joel and Tommy have become soft, the scene still doesn't work. Because there are two other factors in this that still don't make it work, and that would be from Allie and Ellie's perspective. So for Ellie, she haphazardly just charges into the room, which makes zero sense for her character, considering how cautious she usually is. And from everything I could tell when she opens the door, she has line of sight on Abby and doesn't need to walk into the room, which changes the entire scene, by the way. Uh, if she just raises her gun and shoots Abby, the game ends. And then one of the other WLF members, considering how stupid they are, one of them would probably stupidly check where that shot came from, get grabbed. Then Ellie proceeds to use him as a meat shield and kills the other people in the room. Therefore, Ellie would save Tommy at the very minimum, and probably even potentially save Joel, although he would have still gotten the amount of golf club hits that he would have received, so he probably still would have been injured at the very maximum. But then Dina would have arrived nonetheless with Jesse at the top, and they probably could have just healed him from the position they were in, and then everything would have been fine. And if you flip the script to Abby, her role doesn't make any sense in that scene either, because she lets Ellie and Tommy live, which again makes zero sense, considering everything we see later on from Abby that seems to be inconsistent with her character, considering that she has no problem killing other people. And she's even considered the top killer in her group. Even if you look outside of from her past, we learn that she's the top WLF killer. So why wouldn't she kill Ellie and Tommy? Why would she pause when one of the people in the room is threatening to kill her and everyone else in the room? It makes zero sense. So, just to end the comparison, Arthur's death has setup, payoff, and proper execution. Joel's death is inconsistent, has zero setup, and zero payoff if you know the end of the game. Because Ellie lets Abby go. Because two separate flashbacks cause two separate things, both featuring Joel, by the way, and cause two different, completely emotional, manipulative things to happen. So there you go. She lets Abby go, which is inconsistent in it of itself, but whatever. So you have a death scene that makes no sense the more you think about it, and you have a death scene that has the setup, payoff, and execution within its own context, and I'm pretty sure even if you played the first game, it still holds up with Arthur. And I'm confident in saying that even without playing Red Dead Redemption 1. Because from everything I can gauge within the second game, everything seems to be consistently making sense, with the exception of probably a little bit Dutch toward the end, but I don't think that affects anything that happens at the end too much. Um, Considering that it's the Micah's the one who they're trying to get redemption on anyway, so that doesn't affect much of what's actually happening, so there's that. So yeah, I can see why people are making that comparison to be like, hey, Arthur had, within his own game, had all of these things, and Joel had none of these things. Uh, Even if the setup and is all different, uh, it's still really interesting to compare death scenes like this and say, this is how you kill a character properly, and this is how you flip a character 180. And one of the most interesting things, and this is something I haven't personally seen being brought up by anyone, by the way, um, and maybe I just missed it, I don't know. I find it fascinating, simply fascinating, that in the end of part one of The Last of Us, and I promise this will be the end of my comparison, Joel says, and I'm paraphrasing by the way, Joel says something along the lines of, you have to fight, to Ellie by the way, you have to have something to fight for. And once Joel is captured, what does he say? Just finish me off already, or something along those lines. He's like, yeah, just kill me. Even that alone, the writing from 1 to 2, even with the 4 years, even if you say Joel has softened up, whatever excuses you want to make, it's still inconsistent with what we know of Joel alone from part 1 at the end of part 1. I find it so hilarious that the last thing he says to Ellie is like, hey, find something to fight for, and then he's like, yeah, just kill me, whatever. Doesn't matter. My life's not worth anything. Again, complete 180 for no reason. It's just a complete 180. Uh, anyway, back to Arthur. Uh, his journey is exceptionally well done. And then John's journey after the fact is also, it's a little bit slower. Well, I don't know if I'll say slower because it did feel quicker in terms of the overall story, but it slows down in terms of like what he's trying to accomplish at the beginning at the very least. So yeah, in terms of story, besides the one or two missions that felt a little bit off in terms of main story, I would say the overall story is still really, really strong. So that is exactly why I'm going to give Red Dead Redemption 2's story in its completion in the fact that it has multiple endings, which I find adds even more to the overall gameplay. Uh, I'm going to give the story and stories a 9 out of 10. Um, I probably, it's hard to gauge what parts I would probably fix. Very minor things. Again, picking what stories are part of the main story just to tighten it up. Other than that, there isn't really much else I can say that would really tighten the story of Red Dead Redemption 2. It is a very complete story, very strong, and it has more than one ending. So that tells me that they considered a lot when it came to the morale system and the choices you make in Red Dead Redemption 2, making the gameplay have even more impact. But that is a separate score. So let's talk about the gameplay, shall we? Now that we have covered everything that I think there is to say about the story. So, gameplay. Uh, this is a very Western game, a very classic Western game, so it makes sense that the guns in the game are stick to that adherence. They're very classic guns, and it can lead to, uh, you know, a bit of an aiming issue depending. The game will sort of try to auto correct you into, you know, aiming closer to an enemy, but it's not one to one in terms of like, you don't automatically just lock onto somebody. It gets close, but it's not a direct thing. You still have to aim a little bit. Um, there is another feature, one of which I never used, was the slow down, sort of draw thing. Um, unless it was part of the story's version of doing it. Um, in that case, that's fine. Uh, and in terms of other elements, other than that control foible, and it's a very minor one at the most, um, there are a few glitches in the game that I found, uh, none of which they're more funny than game breaking than anything else. But I do want to mention that just to be fair, just to make sure that I'm covering all my bases uh, in terms of saying if there's anything that can be improved in the gameplay. Uh, I've not played the online version of Red Dead Redemption 2. I never got the chance to because the story consumed all of my time. So I can't really say how if there is even a story in the online version, which I don't know if there is, but I shrug. I would assume that the gameplay would be pretty consistent, uh, unless I don't know. Anyway, as far as I can tell, they have set action pieces. Again, I mentioned the blimp, uh, to try to elevate the relatively simple gameplay to you're still shooting, but now you're on a blimp. So have fun with that, I guess. Um, now, I think it's fair to say that this game would probably also be compared to Grand Theft Auto, considering they're both made by Rockstar Games. Now, I will say by comparison that the events of Grand Theft Auto, even if it's through its story and gameplay, seem to be even more bombastic. Crazier things happen. You jump on trains, you like chase cars that are like catching on fire. You're fighting these entire armies of people or whatever. Uh, it gets pretty close, but it seems to be, at least from here, uh, slightly calmed down ever so slightly. It doesn't seem as bombastic as Grand Theft Auto if I were to make the comparison in both gameplay and story. So the bombastic nature seems to be a bit subsided to tell a more grounded story, which I think fits for this type of game, to be fair. Um, so with that, uh, with everything in mind, I'm trying to think if there are any other gameplay faction ports, not ports, parts. There are many side games like you can play poker or any of the other mini games like blackjack. Uh, these are separate games within the game, so there's a whole lot of things you can do in terms of that. Uh, there are other activities such as hunting, something I barely did in the game, by the way. And other than that, there are like other side missions that include hunting people, roping people in, dueling people, quite a few variety of things you can do within the gameplay. So even outside of just shooting people, there's quite a few other activities that you can take part in. And I would not be doing my job if I excluded all of these other activities from the overall gameplay. That wouldn't be fair. So, considering everything, I think it's fair to give this gameplay an 8 out of 10. Again, there are a few bugs that I think that could, uh, you know, that are, again, more funny than game breaking. Um, just a little bit of assistance. The assistance with the aiming part does throw it a little bit off from time to time. But outside of that, I think it's really solid in terms of gameplay as well. So both the gameplay and the story rank very high scores for me. Once again, the story being the 9 and the gameplay being an 8. And that's my full review of Red Dead Redemption 2. And if you ended up enjoying that full review, then please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, make sure to check out those links in the description. One will head you over to my Discord server, the other to my Patreon page. Any donations are greatly appreciated. Until next time, everyone. Bye bye.